Thank you. So Dante lived in Florence, Italy in the 13th century. He is probably most well known for his Divine Comedy, and in particular, Dante's Inferno, which a lot of people have heard about, though very few of us have ever read. It's written in, well, Italian poetry, and who has time for all that? But many of the ideas from Dante's Inferno have sort of filtered down into popular culture. We've heard about it, Dante's Inferno and the rings of hell, right? Like there are kind of different layers to it. And it sort of captured a lot of the Western imagination. And the idea that Dante laid out when he was talking about the Inferno was that there are 9 layers of hell corresponding with different people's sins. So if one person was a glutton, they'd end up on one level. If one person was an adulterer, they would end up on another level. If one person was a violent man or a violent woman, they'd end up somewhere else. And there were all these sort of different punishments that were supposed to equate towards the different sins. And this idea is, though it's just a kind of a creative idea on Dante's part, it has affected a lot of Western culture and our perception of the afterlife. Though people know that Dante had different rings to hell and to ultimate judgment, very few people know what the ultimate sin was for Dante. Like, you started on the outside and worked your way in, but when you got to the 9th circle, like the inner core of hell, What was that about? What was it for? Well, the actual punishment was it was a big ice lake. And people were frozen in this ice lake for all eternity. They could move their heads, but nothing else. And what did you have to do to get to the ninth ring of hell, the ninth circle of hell, to the very interior, for the very worst? How did Dante see it? By the way, this isn't actual theology from the Bible. This is, Dante's sort of creativity, in case you're worried there. But what did Dante see as like the absolute worst sin of all that would get you consigned to that inner ring? For Dante, in his understanding, the thing that would get you sent to the deepest circle of hell was betrayal. Betrayal. Treachery. To betray somebody. That, in Dante's mind, was the worst possible sin. Now, he spoke from experience. He had been involved in politics in Florence and ultimately been thrown out of the city. So he suffered a lot of sort of political betrayal and social betrayal himself. So he kind of spoke as a wounded man, perhaps, when he made that the center of hell. And yet, if we think back into our own lives, what are the things that have traumatized us the most? What are the things that have hurt us the most? What are the things when you look back that, you grind your teeth just a little bit still to this day? If you could go back and get revenge on anybody, it would probably be someone who betrayed you. It wouldn't be a random stranger or a known enemy, but it would be somebody you thought you could trust who did you harm. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was a parent. Maybe it was a child. Maybe it was a sibling. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was someone in church, a church leader or a church member. Maybe it's someone you thought you could trust that came around and wounded you and hurt you in some way. Those are some of the things that traumatize us the most and shape our character the most. They're some of the hardest things to work through. It's no wonder that Dante put that there. We have these sort of personal betrayals that many of us have been through. Now, in betrayal, it's not always that the person seeks to do you harm. Sometimes people betray us just through neglect. We kind of trust people and expect them to be there, and then we go through a difficult time, they're just not there at all. Other times, it's like actively they're seeking to undermine you and they're seeking to hurt or destroy you. Sometimes, in certain countries, throughout the history of humanity, some of this has been induced by the government. The closest thing that I've ever experienced in my life, because I've spent just about my whole life in Western countries, was in Europe in the recent sort of COVID lockdowns. Now, for those of you who were aware of what was happening globally, a lot of the lockdowns in other parts of the world were a lot more severe than they were here in Nebraska. In England, there was a few months went by when everyone was pretty much under house arrest and could only leave. One person from the household could leave to go get food. And that was about it. And it got to the point where there was so much stress and so much hype in the culture that people would actually report on their neighbors. If they were having guests over, if they were having friends over, there was this bizarre sense of patriotism that we all need to comply and go along with this. And if you saw that the little old lady who lives alone in the house across the street was having a neighbor over for a cup of tea, you could call the police on her. And she would be fined. And it was a very bizarre time to be in England, a country that for many years my wife, my family, and I had lived in, and we'd enjoyed as pretty much a free country. But the bizarre circumstances surrounding the lockdowns and COVID and the sort of hysteria that went with it created this weird thing where people were suspicious of neighbors. And if you wanted to have a friend over, you had to have them park like 3 blocks down the road and come in through the forest in the back and come in the back door, and because you didn't want to be seen. You didn't want to be reported to the authorities. You didn't want to be denounced by your neighbors. Now, fortunately, that only lasted a few months, and that was about as extreme as it got. But in many other parts of the world, particularly in communist countries, this has been part and parcel of their whole life. For those born in Eastern Europe in the 1950s, under Soviet communism, where allegiance to the party was everything, and any sense of betrayal or any sense of, not kind of going along with the party line could be reported. But you picked up quick, just as a child. You were careful what you said. There were certain things that could be said at home with your siblings and your parents that you dare not say outside of the house. There was a certain image that needed to be maintained. But if anyone questioned that image and they reported you to the authorities, betrayal. And if you denounced somebody, if you reported somebody, you could be rewarded. You could be given a gift. And sometimes people who were looking to get that promotion, someone who maybe a parent who had a lot of mouths to feed and knew they could get some sort of financial reward by reporting someone, sometimes they go out of their way to actually spy on their neighbors, to see if they could report them and get that promotion or to get that reward. Times were tough. In Nazi Germany, this happened a lot. How did Nazi Germany, how did the authorities find everyone with Jewish or Polish or Eastern European blood? Well, they relied on neighbors reporting them because they would get a reward of some sort. Yes, I think my neighbor, I think he had a grandmother who was Jewish. You might want to just come by and check. Or if you were trying anyways to hide the Jews, or it was the neighbors that reported them. And they were rewarded by the party for doing so. Most of us don't really know what it's like to live in that sort of culture, where betrayal is everywhere. And you have to be careful who you trust. When we get to Good Friday, we're looking at a story of betrayal. We're looking at a story of treachery. It's unsurprising that in Dante's ninth circle, when he gets there, he sees people like Brutus, who betrayed Julius Caesar. But there at the very center of the frozen lake is Judas himself. There wouldn't be Good Friday really without Judas, without this great act of betrayal. That the Son of God, who lived in heaven and was worshipped by angels, became human, not just in the physical sense where he had fingers and toes and, could eat food just like you and me, but he suffered and went through the things that you and I suffer and go through, and he went through them all and in the worst possible way. The story I'm going to read is from Matthew's Gospel. It starts on the evening before he died. In chapter 26 of Matthew, in verse 20, it says, "When it was evening, he reclined at a table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, 'Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me.'" Now, this was a shocker. You can imagine, you had 13 guys sitting around the table, and, they kind of laid around the table. The tables didn't work quite the same back then as they do today. There wasn't really the chairs. It was more like couches or bunches of pillows, and you kind of almost lay around the table and prop yourself up with one arm, and there'd be all these hands shooting out, kind of grabbing food, and you didn't eat with fork and knife, you kind of ate with your hands, so you got this little bit of a table and a whole bunch of guys just kind of leaning and reclining and grabbing food together, and they would, it was Passover, so there's some lamb, they were all going for some meat, I guess, and there was wine there, plenty of red wine was flowing, and you would take bread. Back then they didn't wipe butter on bread. They would take the bread and dip it in the broth and eat the bread like that. And they were all reaching for different food together, all their hands at the table. And then Jesus, right in the middle of this, while they're celebrating the Passover, he says, "Oh, by the way, one of you is going to betray me." That'll kill a dinner conversation right there. I mean, tensions were high at this point. Jesus was a celebrity. People were hoping he'd be the political figure, that he would be the new leader of Israel. He had very powerful enemies at this time, and for him to say, and so all the disciples knew the enemies were without, but now Jesus drops, actually, there's an enemy within. And it shocks everybody. He says, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him, one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" He says this, and John's gospel records that as he said this, he was shaken. And Jesus himself was very sorrowful. That Jesus was upset, that Jesus was grieved to be saying this. I'm going to be betrayed. It's a hard thing to say if you know that it's someone that you've loved, someone that you've trusted, is about to put the knife in your back. Jesus was grieved and upset as he said it, and when he said it, the other disciples were upset as well. The entire feel of the dinner changed just like that. What's interesting is, though, their response, what they say. They're sorrowful, they're upset, they're grieved that one of them could dare betray Jesus. But what they didn't do is look at Judas. It's not like they all glanced over at him and be like, yeah, that guy's a bit shady right there. He's a bit sketch. You know, we knew something was up with that guy. They didn't. He hid it. Well, no, we don't know when exactly Judas began getting these thoughts about betraying Jesus. Maybe it wasn't very long at all. Maybe it had been building, but subconsciously, and only maybe just days prior, something clicked in Judas that made him want to do it. What his motives were, we don't entirely know. Maybe it was the fact that he was Jewish in the sense that he was from Judea, from the Jerusalem area, whereas Jesus and all the other disciples were from up north in Galilee. And although they were all Hebrew and Israeli in that sense, they were not all Jewish in the local sense. They were not all from the Judean area. A lot of times we see that word Jew in the New Testament in the Gospels, and we think that just means any Jew from anywhere. Well, that was not just a general term for Hebrews. Sometimes it was, but sometimes it was just a local term. The Jews versus the Galileans. They're all Jewish in the sense they're all Hebrew, but Judas was actually a Jew. Hence his name, Judah, Jewish. So maybe it was a regional thing. Maybe he was back in Jerusalem and he was seeing the Pharisees and a lot of the people he grew up with since they were down there in Jerusalem, and he thought, maybe I'm on the wrong side. I went up and joined this Galilean outfit and have been traveling around with, Jesus and Peter and John and James, and, they have all those funny accents and everything. But now I'm back in my home turf, and Jesus is, there's these tight political tensions between Jesus and all the rabbis and Pharisees I grew up under. Maybe it's time to switch sides. Maybe it's a bit of nostalgia. Saying, hey, I want to be on the right side here. I want to join my home team where I grew up. Maybe. We don't know. Maybe it was greed for money. He betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But I got to say, 30 pieces of silver wasn't a lot of money. It wasn't. It would have been, for a betrayal of that size, for a leader of Jesus' size, it would have been less than $10,000. Which for that sort of level of betrayal wouldn't have been that much money. Much more money than that would have passed through Judas's hands as the treasurer. What it is that motivated Judas exactly, we don't know. We don't know how long he was thinking about it. But it's this, that he was in the midst with all the other disciples, doing miracles, preaching the gospel, doing everything that the others did without anyone being suspicious at all. And these men lived together for 3 years. Not just got to know each other as buddies once a week and went out for a drink occasionally. These men slept out under the stars and had meals together and cooked. And they went out 2 by 2 on mission preaching the gospel. And Judas did miracles. All these things. And here we are at the table. And Jesus says, someone's going to betray me. No one looks at Judas. They're worried. They're upset. First of all, they're fearful for themselves. Is it me? Now, that's an interesting response right there. You'd think, you'd look outward and point to someone else. Where were you yesterday afternoon? That sort of thing. But no, they all looked inward. Is it me? Maybe by this point, 3 years after following Jesus, they're aware of their own propensity to sin. They're aware of their own shortcomings. They're aware of the fact that they don't always live up to the message they're trying to emulate in the person of Jesus. They're just humans, like us. Sometimes we feel that way. God, am I going to let you down? Lord, I want to be a good Christian, but God, I just fear that there's too much darkness in me. I'm going to disappoint you. I know it. They all ask is it me? And he answers, he who has dipped the hand in the dish with me will betray me. Well, that didn't really give it away because everyone had been dipping their bread in the broth and everyone had been eating together. Again, they all ate with hands out of different bowls. And it was just another way of him saying, guys, it's one of you. It's not some other disciple out there somewhere. It's here at this table. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had not been born. We're told as Christians not to judge in the sense of, it's not for us to condemn a person whether they're in heaven or in hell. Hey, that's God's job. That's not for us. But I got to say, if Jesus says it's better for that man not to have been born, chances aren't looking too good for you. Chances aren't looking too good. This guy's about to betray the Son of God who's come into the world to bring salvation, and Judas is going to be that instrument of betrayal. Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Now, he must have been close enough to whisper this so that the others didn't hear it. I'm not sure exactly just where everyone was sitting or how he communicated this or if he lived. I don't know. He said it, but some way without the others hearing of it. And it was a very disingenuous thing because we know from Matthew's gospel, he already had the money in his pocket. The 30 pieces of silver were there while he was looking his friend Jesus in the eye and said, "Is it me?" Jesus says, "You have said so." In other words, you know you're the one. This whole theme of betrayal, it's not a new theme in the Bible. David talked about this on a number of occasions in the Psalms. In Psalm 41:9, he wrote, "My close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." My best friend. We had meals together. We shared food together. And it's not just that you let me down. All friends let each other down at some point. But you actually worked to do me harm. I mean, there's kind of friends that let you down sometimes because they're not there for you when you need them. And that hurts enough. That's kind of bad enough. But to actually someone actively be consciously thinking about doing you harm, that's kind of taking on a whole new level. And David, King David, who lived 1,000 years before Jesus, experienced this. That he ate bread with someone. This is why Matthew records, Jesus is using this language. The person who's dipping bread with me is betraying me. While he was still speaking, Judas came. So we skip down a few verses, down to verse 47. They finish up their dinner, and then they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, which many of you might be familiar with. Judas had got up and left. He went to go get the soldiers. The other disciples didn't know that. They thought Judas was just going out to get something from the meal. Hey, maybe we've run out of drinks, and Jesus sent Judas to go get some drinks or someone. No one suspected it was Judas. It was only Jesus who knows. It's only Judas who knows. Jesus then at that time goes down to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he goes. He knows he's about to be betrayed. He knows he's about to be tortured. He knows he's about to be murdered. And he goes down to pray. He asks his disciples to pray with him, and they've just had a big meal with wine, and they all fall asleep. And he is up praying alone to God, where it's recorded he sweat drops of blood. He's, in a way, we don't think of Jesus as being terrified. We don't think of Jesus as being scared. He's the Son of God, right? And yet he's about to go to the cross and die, not just physical torments, but spiritually carry all the evil and the sin of the world on his back while doing it. A type of torment it's hard for us to get our heads around. He's praying, and he finishes his prayer, and he goes and he wakes up his disciples. Guys, wake up. I asked you to pray with me. You all fell asleep. That's all right. I love you anyway. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do you what you came to do?" Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. Judas comes up. He's got this crowd of soldiers with him. And he gives the sign. It's like the most bitter betrayer possible. I'll go up to him and give him a kiss on the cheek, which was a normal greeting for men who were very close. They were like brothers. If you had a best friend, you're a man, you have a best friend, he's like a brother to you, you would greet him with that sort of family kiss on the cheek. That's what they still do in a lot of Mediterranean cultures. And Judas said, "I'm going to betray him with a kiss." In other words, a great sign of friendship and trust. That's how you're going to know who it is. And Jesus, I'm tempted when Jesus, what's the first word out of his mouth? Friend. Friend. I'm tempted. If I would have been in that situation, you better believe that term would have been absolutely dripping with sarcasm. Friend. Like I would have vomited the word out at him, Friend. Like, how dare you call yourself my friend? I was a friend to you and you betrayed me, and yet I'm not sure, sometimes we just have the text, we don't always have the tone. I don't know if, even at this point, Jesus was being a good friend to Judas. Judas, you're going to betray me, but I'm still a faithful friend to you. I'm about to go and die for the sin of the world. Judas, are you sure you want to do this? I think he actually said the word sincerely. I know I wouldn't have, but I think Jesus probably said it sincerely. Friend, do what you came to do. They take Jesus away. Again, King David writes in another psalm, "It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant." That word friend, we throw that word around a lot. We have 1,000 friends on Facebook, and that's an old friend I went to school with, and friend this, and I'm going to friend you, or I don't like your political post, I'm going to unfriend you. That's kind of how it works. This word friend gets a lot of abuse nowadays. But back then, friend was like a sacred word. It was a special word. It was like, if someone is your friend, it's like that's someone close to you that you've chosen. It's like a sibling, a brother or sister, but you're kind of stuck with your brothers or sisters. Like they're assigned to you. But a friend is someone who you've given your trust to, and you've chosen to do that. So it's a very special term. And so it talks about like a breaking of friendship, almost be like a breaking of a covenant. Almost like the breaking of a marital vow when something comes between two friends like this. Look, Jesus is taken away. He's put on trial. He's beaten. He's about to be led to his death. And when Judas sees all this, again, we don't know Judas's motive. Some people thought, well, maybe Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand and to become this political, military, revolutionary, or we don't know. We just don't know what was going through Judas's mind. But when he saw what the fruit of his actions were, it says in the next chapter here in Matthew 27. It says, "And when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' And they said, 'What is this to us? See to it yourself.' And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself." He went and hanged himself. Matthew doesn't just say he killed himself, it says he hanged himself. And Matthew is the only one to put that detail in there. Now, why is this? There's a few things going on in this story that's helpful for us to know. Matthew, he's writing to a Jewish audience. And the purpose of his gospel is to show that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David. The long-awaited one. For centuries, the Jews were waiting for the Messiah, for the Son of David to come into the world. The one that would be the new and second David, that would lead Israel into, once again, greatness. The one that would be Israel's new great king. And Matthew's writing his gospel to show his Jewish audience that Jesus is that Son of David. This is why he's describing the whole relationship with Judas the way he did. Those Psalms that I read earlier from David, David knew a betrayal a lot like Judas. It was his eldest son, Absalom. Absalom was David's eldest son, the crown prince, the one who sat next to him. And yet he betrayed David and tried to overthrow his father and steal away the throne. And the whole story is recorded in the Old Testament. David had many people to be suspicious of. He was in politics, after all. And he had there's a lot of treachery going on in any court. But he never suspected his own son, his eldest son, to betray him like that and try to kill him so that he could have the throne. How did Absalom die? Well, he got hung up from a tree. He got hung up from a tree. In sort of a very bizarre story, he had this really big haircut, which would have been not unusual for a prince in that day, and he was trying to escape from the battlefield, and his hair got caught in a branch of a tree. And he was caught and hung, and that's ultimately how he died. And so Matthew makes the connection. This was the friend who betrayed, who went and hung himself and died in the tree. Jesus is the king who knows what it's like to be betrayed. Jesus just didn't die, he was betrayed to death. I was earlier talking about, some of these social things where people, where we know betrayal. Of course, I mentioned our time in England, but much more substantially, there's the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. There was a book written back in the year 1960. That's 15 years after the end of World War II. So 15 years after the fall of the Nazi Empire. And there was a German pastor there by the name of Gunther Rutenborn. And Gunther Rutenborn, he was a pastor, and he, within his congregation and within wider society, he noticed that so many German people were still struggling to process the guilt and the shame of World War II, of the whole Nazi regime. Like, they didn't know what to do with that guilt, and they didn't know what to do with that shame, and there was never really a resolution to it. Yes, they had come, and there was the Nuremberg trials where they put some of the very top leadership of the Nazi party, put them on trial. But what about everybody else? Because deep down, people knew it just wasn't the leaders at the very top who were guilty. Everyone was kind of guilty. And even 15 years later, people were still dealing with this like it wasn't healthy. And so he wrote a little play that ended up becoming a show, like a piece of theater there in Berlin. And in it, there's all these different individuals. The prophet Jonah comes, strangely enough, and he is like the judge. And the prophet Jonah is going to kind of judge Germany and see, all right, who's guilty? And there's like the average man, and then there's the average woman, and then there's the aristocrat, and then there's the merchant. And all these different people come and say, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. But it's got to be somebody's fault. And one by one, you hear these different stories come up. Someone comes forward and said, I sent my son off to war and died. I had to see my only son killed. And someone else came forward and they said, our family was a bunch of Polish refugees, and we came into Germany, and we just had little kids with us, but we were refugees, and we had no place to live. And other people said, well, my home was a good German, and I supported the right, but our home was bombed by an air raid, and we just had to live out under the stars. And someone else said, well, I was been denounced and betrayed by my neighbors, even though I didn't do anything wrong. And someone else came forward and said, well, I was injured in the war, and look at my leg, I can't walk anymore, I'm in a wheelchair. And other people said, well, what about the Jews and how they were all executed? And all this blaming starts happening, and the blame goes up. Well, it's not me, it's not me, it's me. And it kind of works its way up to the very top. It's like, well, it's got to be, the ruler's fault. The people who are ruling, and it keeps going up. And eventually, everyone in the play decides, I know whose fault it is. It's got to be God's fault. It's God's fault that all of this happened. And so they have a big court trial, and they put God on trial. And they say, right, we have ruled, God, that this whole World War II is all your fault. Everything that happened, all these bad things that everyone went through, ultimately, God, it's your fault, and we blame you. And so they get an angel to kind of go up to heaven to deliver God his verdict. And one by one, they come forward and say what God's punishment is going to be. And someone comes forward and says, well, I lost my son in the war. Therefore, God, you have to know what it's like to lose an only son. God, you need to know what it's like to be born to a family of fleeing refugees. God, you know need to know what it's like to wander about and have to sleep under the stars and have no place to lay your head. God, you need to know what it's like to live under a country where the political powers are always out to get you. You need to know what it's like to suffer physically the way we suffered physically. And you ultimately need to be executed as a Jew. And the word comes back from heaven and says, punishment accepted. Christ, the Son of God, he had no obligation to come here to earth. The Son of God never needed to know what it was like to be betrayed in the sense that you and I suffer betrayal. He voluntarily took this life. We suffer all sorts of terrible things in this life. We have physical suffering, we have relational suffering, psychological suffering. We go through all sorts of hardship. We don't choose any of it. But Christ chose the life that he did. And he chose to come and bear our sin and our guilt. Why did he do it? He did it for us. He laid down his life for us. I'm talking about betrayal, and throughout most of it, many of us have been thinking about people who have betrayed us, people who have hurt us. With the times we've been like Jesus, and these other Judases out there have betrayed us. And well, certainly that's true. It's good to know that, Christianity is the only religion in the world where God gets betrayed to death. And it's good to know that when we're betrayed, hey, God knows what that's like, and not only that, but just as Jesus was betrayed, and yet God used that somehow to bring redemption into the world, God can bring good out of your betrayals. The way people have hurt and betrayed you, look to God. He can use that somehow for good. He can. And yet we're not always the innocent ones, are we? If we're honest, like the disciples were, we look inside of us, and we all know that there's a little Judas who lives inside of here, isn't there? No, maybe we haven't actively gone out to seek to do God harm or hurt Jesus, but at least we've been like the other disciples. If not traitors by intent, at least traitors by neglect. The ones who fall asleep on him, the ones who aren't there for him. And Jesus goes to the cross for everyone who would ultimately let him down. Jesus went to the cross not for the great disciples, not for the perfect ones, not for the ones who got it all right, but Jesus went to the cross for people who would betray, for people who would say they're Christians and yet live completely differently. He went to the cross for you, and he went to the cross for me, to save and redeem every traitor who's ever lived. I ask the elders to come forward and help distribute the elements at this time. Thank you. We're going to distribute the juice and the bread here. If you're new with us, maybe you're not haven't had communion with us before, just hold on to the juice and the bread as it goes around. And then once the psalm is over, we'll take that juice and that bread together. Father, we do thank you for this bread and this juice. Lord, we thank you how you have died in our place for our sins. Lord, as we take this, God, let us remember your death, that you died by love and not just by treachery. Amen.